encourage questions from the floor. We have people on Jabber and Facebook and whatever, and we have people in the room watching that. So we'll get questions from them as well. So let me ask you guys each in turn, who are you? What's your position? What's your organization? What does it do?
Good morning. I'm Russ Housley. I'm currently the chair of the IETF. The IETF was established in 1986. In short, we make the internet work. We do that by producing high quality, relevant technical engineering documents that influence the way people design, use, and manage the internet. The most well-known of those are the standards that are in RFC documents. But in addition to the protocol standards, we also do best practices and other informational documents. An important thing to realize is that no one is in charge of the internet. Rather, people work together collaboratively simply because they choose to. So when you're developing those standards, they're clearly voluntary to implement, and it's important that they be relevant or they will be ignored. And we have some examples that are highly relevant and some that are highly ignored. One of the things that the IETF does is bring together a very diverse group to work on these documents. And the diversity of that group sometimes makes it difficult to reach consensus. But when consensus does emerge through discussion, the result is better understood, more clearly documented, and more strongly supported than the initial position of any of those participants. The IETF uses a very open standards process. All interested people are invited to participate, even if they're unable to come to face-to-face meetings. We do so on mail list discussions, and all documents, not just the RFCs, but every version of the proposed RFC are available online for free discussion. The goal is one internet that's voluntary standards for a global internet with maximum interoperability and scalability. We avoid specialized protocols in various regions of the world, and in our discussions we focus on the technical aspects of the documents with our mantra, rough consensus, and running code driving the debate.
Good morning, I'm Steve Mills, and I'm president of the Standards Association at the IEEE. The IEEE is a global organization with over 425,000 members. The IEEE is involved in a broad range of technical areas: power and energy, data communications, computer science, etc. The Standards Association oversees all standards activities in the IEEE. At any point in time, there's over 1,500 active standards and projects, and over 20,000 individuals contributing to the standards development activities. And those standards, again, cover that broad range of technical areas. Examples include nuclear energy safety standards, data communication standards, some vehicular standards, etc. And perhaps the most relevant for the audience here is the physical device standards that come out of the IEEE, many of which come from IEEE 802, including Ethernet and Wi-Fi. Thank you.
It's okay. My name is Raymond Akwule. I am president of the Digital Bridge Institute in Nigeria. We have a multi-campus advanced ICT training institute, campuses in Lagos, Abuja, and Kano. and evolving campuses in 3 other locations. I don't work for a standards organization, but I do head an organization that actually trains people in some standards-related areas. But we also have a lot of our clients, students, belong to some of the standards organizations. Now, I come at this topic from my own experience, having been on both sides of the aisle. For 25 years, I was a professor at George Mason University in Virginia, and I currently am in the Center for International Cyber Center of the Computer Science Department at George Mason as a senior fellow. So I continue to at least watch what goes on in the standards development community. The topic we have today is really looking at the status of collaboration, international collaboration, and how that collaboration has impacted standards overall. And I think if we do what we're supposed to do, we should come up with some ideas for improving that aspect of it, that is international collaboration in the standards building in the area of internet architecture and all of that. The first thing I want to note is that if we look at the status quo right now as things are, we notice that there's been a lot of very good work being done by organizations like the IETF, excellent work actually, IEEE, ICANN, but if we are to listen to what we've heard the last day or two, the internet being a global network that would all like to be very inclusive, still has a long way to go. And it still has a long way to go, specifically in the area of standards building. Now, when we say that the internet is still not doing all of what we want it to do, one of the things it occurs to me is that the more inclusive in terms of the resources, the skill sets, the diversity of people who contribute at the core technical level to develop the internet, the better we all are. How do we make that happen? It is clear from all of the things we've heard the last several days that participation is not nearly as inclusive as we would like to see it. In fact, I have some statistics which we'll go into later, just to show that we have a lot of work in trying to draw out some technical skills and technical participation from some areas of the world. So I come to this from that standpoint, having been, again, in Virginia, doing a lot of, associating and doing a lot of the work that a lot of you who I see I've met at this conference are doing, but also now being in what I call the trenches and seeing how the work that we used to do in Virginia impacts what happens on the other side of the aisle. And really my goal, and I hope the goal of this panel, is to see how we can elicit ideas, if not from ourselves, from some of the members of the audience, as to how we can, even in incremental steps, move this closer to where we would all like it to be.
Thank you. I'm Steve Crocker. I chair the ICANN board of directors and have a little company, Shinkuro. I want to talk a bit about the interplay among various standards bodies. There's a sort of a apocryphal little line about the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And we all got together yesterday and tried to organize ourselves, and in addition to laying out sort of what the sequence of who would say what when, we actually got into a bit of a substantive discussion, and a very specific thought came to mind which I want to share with you, and maybe it'll be stimulating, maybe it'll shake things up a little bit. But to get there, I need to go back in time and paint a picture. I had the privilege of working on the ARPANET at its earliest days, and one of the challenges in the ARPANET was of the most mundane nature. Computers in that area, we're talking about mid-60s, mid to late 1960s, were all built with the idea that each one was the center of its own world and had no connection, no physical capability for being connected to anything else on a peering basis. There were connections for tape drives and for terminals sometimes and for printers and the like. But it was all, the computer was the center, and all of these peripheral devices, and that was the term that was used, were of secondary nature. And so the communications was initiated by the computer generally, or had a very specific protocol for interacting with each of these devices. And so there was no natural way to connect two computers together. Prior to the ARPANET, there had been a lot of several small networking experiments, many of which foundered just on the technical difficulty of trying to connect two computers directly to each other. And one of the things that happened as a necessity, but also in a fairly natural way, was that when the ARPANET was built and the first IMPs, which are, we would now call them routers, came in, each of them had a specification for how to connect to it. And Bolt, Brannick, and Newman published the specification, and the specification was as simple as they could make it. It was a series of wires, and you had to go build your own interface to get to those wires. And so in each of the sites around the network, a special piece of hardware had to be designed that was peculiar to the computer that was involved. The manufacturers didn't have any standard parts available, and so you actually had to sort of open up the cabinet and find out where you were going to connect up, and then you had to go to the laboratory and design and build a special interface. And for the first couple of years, each of those interfaces was a one-off design, a very and now you can go down to the store, not even an electronics store, you can go to sort of a stationary store almost, and just buy these parts and connect them in, and everybody expects things to work. So it was with that image in mind, when we were having this discussion yesterday about standards organizations and the kind of uninteresting things that get in the way of cooperating across standards bodies. What are the rules for consensus in one body versus another? Even if the technical people all reach what they think is common agreement, what happens after that in terms of getting documents published and referencing and so forth? So here's the simple and perhaps uninteresting idea, or perhaps revolutionary. Each standards body thinks of itself. They don't do this explicitly, and they don't do it, purposefully. But in effect, each standards body that exists generally around the world thinks of itself as operating in isolation, and it's the center of its own world. Whether it's the IETF, whether it's the IEEE, whether it's ISO, whether it's anything else. And so, cooperation across standards bodies is a awkward, ungainly process that does not have any standards of its own. So the novel thought is, suppose we ask each standards body to rethink itself in terms of not only developing its own standards, but being constructed and having processes in place that are designed to interact with other standards bodies. And rather than having each one of them do that for themselves, one could imagine trying to lay out what are the elements of cooperation and have kind of a standard for standards body interactions. So that sounds kind of abstract and sort of ultra philosophical, but the elements are probably not all that complicated. They are, as I alluded, elements of technical interchange, access to the various documents that are involved, who's allowed to participate, who's allowed to have access after the fact, what are the consensus processes, what are the publication processes. And one could lay out, I'm imagining, a kind of template as to what those elements have to be, and then get some number of standards bodies, not going to get them all at once, to decide that, yeah, cooperation across standards bodies is probably more of a normal thing rather than an exceptional thing, something to plan for in advance and lay out standards for standards, if you will. Over to you.
So thanks, Steve. I'm amused by what you just said, and thinking about an interaction we've had along those lines in the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, the Architecture Committee, in which case we're reading documents from a variety of standards bodies, and some of them here and some of them other places. And we have to decide whether we like them, and if we like them, then we'll recommend them to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so getting access to documents, in the case of one particular standards body, they said, well, yes, you can ask for any document that you want to get, we'll consider it. And we'll, assuming we say yes, we'll give you a 90-day license to read the document after you sign a 75-page NDA. Is that what you were thinking of?
Well, that would be one candidate for a common standard among standards, but I suspect that it might not reach the past the consensus process among standards bodies.
It didn't pass consensus in the SGAC. Okay, so Russ. Huh?
Can I say something about that? So the smart grid effort that Fred was just alluding to had 22 standards organizations involved in it, and we were each standards organization was asked to send a spokesman to this conference to participate in a panel. So a panel with 22 SDO leads, and with this point that Fred was making, each of the SDOs was asked to say how they could share their documents. And so the first person to speak was from ISO IEC, and he talked about how the revenue generated by selling their books was so important to their continued operation. And other people followed suit defending, the revenue model is what they were defending. Other people stood up and said that their documents were freely available just like RFCs. And so it was clear to me that the audience, and they knew that the audience knew how available RFCs are. And so when it got to me, I think I was like the 20th person of the 22, I just stood up and said, my standards are RFCs, and sat back down.
In order to point them to the RFCs, I had to write an RFC. But, okay, so a question that we had talked about discussing here, what issues do you think prevent people from contributing to standards development? Sorry? Oh.
Yeah, this is Olaf Kolkman. What I've heard Steve say was more about the interaction between standards organizations rather than as a consumer or a consumer group trying to get standards from a set of bodies. And on both points I have a remark. The getting standards from your peering or interaction with your peering organization is about good neighborship. It's maintaining the little pathway. It's making sure that the fences are well maintained and painted. You know, it's a common benefit. The other part, accessibility of standards. There is an underlying assumption that all standards are equal. But some organizations do not treat all standards as equal. I give as an example the European Committee, which is currently, fortunately, modernizing its approach to standards. But all the at least standards organizations that are on this table, the IEEE and the IETF, are seen as a forum or consortium and not as a formal standards organization, which means that in the European Committee you cannot formally refer to those specifications. Are there any comments on that?
If I might just divert just a bit and comment on the collaboration across standards organizations as well as access to documents. I'll preface this by saying I agree with Steve's comments. I think that there are ways for us to develop stronger collaborative interactions, and the way to get there is to decide that we want to go there and continue to work towards it. Now, looking at my situation in the IEEE, I mentioned that there's a broad range of technical areas. In fact, there are 45 well-structured organizations within the IEEE that each focus on a particular technical area. You have to look at the genesis of the standards activities from the various organizations that we were considering. And in the case of the IEEE, the genesis of standards grew out of the historical and cultural approach that the IEEE takes. And that comes from publication. For any of us here who have ever published, you know that publishing through the IEEE is a well-known and well-respected vehicle. And it's that way because of the rigor that they apply to the peer review of documents, et cetera. And they try their best to get high quality technical papers that they publish in their magazines and journals. Standards grew out of that. So the culture of standards in the IEEE is one with a high rigor towards technical excellence. And it also grew up sort of distributed within the IEEE. So we have 45 societies and councils, each focused on a particular technical area. And some of those societies and councils have multiple standards activities, and the IEEE refer to those as sponsors. IEEE 802, the Local Area Network, Metropolitan Area Network Standards Committee, is a sponsor in the IEEE. They all have their independent cultures. And this becomes very evident when you try to bring those together. And we did this in a smart grid activity, P2030, which is an architecture overview of smart grid. And in that we brought the communications folks together with the IT folks together with the power and energy folks. And although the processes are similar because the Standards Association works to ensure that the processes are similar, they're not totally identical. But the more important thing is the culture. The culture of our organizations is different. Our processes are different, yes. The thing is, they work. They work for the particular areas that each of our organization focus on. And we have to respect that as well. And I think collaboration starts with the respect for those various processes. Now, access to documents. The reason I gave you some of this history is because standards in the IEEE is a function of the artifacts of where the IEEE came from. It's a publishing organization. Historically, the view for standards as well as the other types of intellectual property in the IEEE is publishing and deriving revenues from publication. We recognize that we need to move away from that. But that's a long-term objective because you've got to find alternative sources of revenue. But we also recognize the importance of certain standards. So you don't always see standards from the IEEE with a significant fee associated with it. And again, the example of that would be 802, where we have a program in 802 where all documents are available freely for download 6 months after publication. And in fact, we've just initiated another program where any document that isn't in that category is available for a $5 fee. And then just one last comment. Our organization was one of the organizations that stepped up to the smart grid request and made all of our documents available. So when it makes sense for the contribution that we think it is our responsibility to make, we make our documents available. But again, it's all an evolution. And we have to step up to the objectives that we want to commonly achieve. And I have absolute confidence we can make it happen.
So I'd like to, I already talked about the second half of that, but on the first, we've had some experiences with collaboration that have been very successful and ones that have not been so. The ones, but they all have to be based on bringing in participants from both of the organizations, working together to come up with the document. The structures associated with approving and then publishing those is where we have faltered in the past. One example is digitally signing XML, where the W3C and the IETF had a joint working group, and we came up actually fairly quickly with the document. But the getting both approval processes to agree on exactly the same text at exactly the same time took a really long time. So much so that it dwarfed the actual development of the specification. And so we'd agreed we needed another way to do things in the future, and we found that it was faster to have one group approve it and then the other one approve it instead of trying to do some interlocked joint thing. Which is what we did in a subsequent endeavor to where we worked together. We're currently working on something we call real-time communications using the web. And what we did in this particular case is we divided the work into two buckets, that which will be approved by the IETF and that which will be approved by the W3C. And the people are working collaborative on both buckets, but the approval process for each piece of the work is very clear so that we're not introducing unneeded delay. And so that's another way to work on the approach. Anyway, the point is we're trying real hard to find a way through this, and I think after we have enough of experiences of these various kinds, then maybe we can try to abstract away, as Steve suggested. But I think it needs to be based on pragmatic experience.
I agree with Russ. I think my advice would be keep it simple. And for me, keeping it simple would be do it in one place. You know, we have to ask ourselves the question, why do we have to have exactly the same text in both organizations? I think we respect the processes of the organizations that we would be involved in well enough to know that if the document is produced in one place, it'll be a solid document. And that's how I think we need to view this, and how I try to work whenever we encounter an opportunity to engage with one organization or another in our standards work.
Hi, this is Alexa. I'm curious to find out what examples have you guys had of collaboration between the organizations that has not worked, and what has been the lessons learned that are applicable outside?
I don't want to dominate this discussion, but I have to say, I'm not going to give you names, but the one particular most recent example of a collaborative effort that didn't work is one where industry didn't want it to, where the stakeholders didn't want it to. You know, we have, in certain standards activities, there's a fairly high level of competition. There, I said it. You know, people come in and they don't really want to reach consensus in certain cases. Sometimes when that happens, they use the various venues, various standards organization in order to continue the competition. To me, that's a very difficult situation that you need to be very cautious about, because just collaborating across the two, it's not the two standards organizations that are competing. It's the participants in the process that are competing. We have to find a way to encourage them to strive for the cooperative sort of spirit that we need, the coopetition spirit that we need in order to reach consensus. Those are the ones that typically are the most difficult to manage, I think. When you're aligned on an objective, you know what you want for the result, we can make those happen, I have no doubt.
So I agree with that as well. Maybe we agree on way more than we disagree, but there's a case between IEEE 802 and the IETF where there was a miscommunication at the very beginning that led to many surprises on the journey where we thought we had dealt with it at the beginning of the process, but the liaison statements that were exchanged were too polite, and the actual meaning got lost. And it wasn't until much further down the road we realized, oh, that's what you were trying to tell us. And the whole thing would have been avoided with a phone call, with a frank discussion between the leadership. And so I encourage informal communication in addition to the formal communication, just to make sure that the human-to-human communication is happening.
So
Let's give Bert an opportunity.
Thanks, Fred, Bert Wijner, but I want to switch to another topic, so if Alexa has more to this, then let her go first.
just a follow-up question. How soon did you guys realize in that situation, Steve, that there was this sort of competitive type of interaction?
Personally, I knew it right out of the gate. And so it didn't go, the effort didn't go very far because we knew that that was the issue. And for me, I think the communication, when you communicate from organization to organization, needs to be on what can we do to help the participants align on the goal. And if the cooperation is intended to try to fix the competitive situation, don't try to do a joint collaborative effort. Focus on the people and try to get them to align.
Bert Wijnen. So, since we already did half an hour on this topic, and what Raymond brought up about not being inclusive, so I have two questions. One is, you mentioned specifically the IETF, and I guess that's proper in this ISOC event. With that regard, my question would be, do you have ideas how we can better be including people from not just Africa, but also South America and maybe Asia area and so on? And my second question would be, or maybe that's the one that you should answer first, is do you see that same problem with participating in, for example, ITUT related areas or in IEEE, in general in other standards organizations as opposed to just IETF? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first thing I want to note is that, this is the global internet we're talking about. I mean, we've had other kinds of collaboration in standards, in other kinds of technology-related activities. But when we're talking about the global internet, I think we all, as a collective community, have some sense of where we would like the internet to be next year, the year after. And in order to do that, I think much of the core of the activities really comes down to standards and the technology behind the internet. Now, as you could see from the discussions, even just here, if we don't begin to pay attention to how to modify our models so that it becomes more inclusive, what is happening here is what's going to continue to happen next year, the year after. The discussion is going to be centered around certain geographic parts of the world, and so it's between them. This is what we did, and this is what our federal agency did, and that sort of thing. Now, how do we begin to rectify that? I think that one of the things I saw missing in the models, and again, I repeat that the groups individually have done well, and you could see even by this conference that they are all really struggling to answer the question that you are asking now. How do we include more of the groups? But I think that one of the elements I didn't see is part of what the internet builders in the early days used, and that is universities. Okay, Now, we, using an example, but from another field, not from standards building, what we have done recently, that is the Digital Bridge Institute, we have a very solid partnership with the Berkman Center for Internet and Policy at Harvard University and the Sam Nunn School for International Affairs and the Computer Science Joint Program at Georgia Tech. And what we've done is the nature of this partnership is a model that I would like to explore and bring over to the area of standards. Practically, for the past 3 years, the two gentlemen from Harvard and from Georgia Tech come to the Digital Bridge Institute in Abuja. We actually sit down in my office and we decide what we're going to do for the rest of the year. Now, what we've done in those 3 years have focused on new media and how we can use the tools of the Web 2.0 to apply to several specific industries. That's what we decide in those meetings that we have in January. Now, based on that, we've had probably about 5 different workshops and then, papers that go back and forth based on that. But it is a multi-stakeholder approach. When we do that, okay, they to the universities, we are an institute, so it's sort of universities that have access to all of the resources and sort of intellectual and skills resources that you can talk about in terms of this kind of joint collaboration. And then we are sitting on the other side, knowing the nature of the problems and maybe how to actually permeate the society in terms of the difficulties that you see in the literature, which is the difficulty that groups like IETF would have, trying to understand who to go to in Africa, how to really navigate, okay? So together, we put together this program, and we are able to then invite civil society within Nigeria. In one of the programs, I actually had 170 non-governmental groups, just civil society groups. We focused on them, okay, because we wanted to introduce certain kinds of technology-related issues, ICT-related concepts, practices that they could use, especially in getting people involved in the democratic process. So each time we focus on one element. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. There is value in using university resources. However you craft that university resource, it could be collaboration between universities, to broker, essentially, be a sort of an objective convener of the different groups that are trying to reach a certain goal. I see that working also in the area of standards. There are many people scattered around Africa. Some of them are in this room. People like Nikweno, who has been involved with this whole process from the start. There's Adiel over here, Lishan Adams. There are many of those people who, if we can tap, the energy and the resources that they have built around themselves, and through them get to the university communities. I keep using this university and sort of not just university, institutional communities that are more academic and training oriented, okay, to help organize and foster the ideas that will bring the international community and the African groups together to try to build towards the creation of a critical mass. Now, if you look at, I was just looking at some of the figures. IETF, I'm sorry, the Internet Engineering Task Force has been central, as you know, to the development of this the technology in the Internet. But in their recent summary of participation, and as open as it is, there's almost no barrier to entry. In terms of the participation even in the ideas leading to standards. But even as open as it is, when there's just the latest data that just came out, which courtesy of one of my colleagues on the panel over here, we see that, for example, North America contributed 2,989 authors. Authors participated. Europe, 916 authors. From Australia, we had 53 authors. From Asia, 411 authors. From South America, 3. and from Africa, 1. Now, this is even with all of the effort they've made to make this as open as it is. Now, what is the problem? Before I came to this conference, I myself paid very little attention to the organization because it's not when I knew of IEEE. I mean, I have even members within my group who always they say, please sign something for me to go to an IEEE meeting, okay? Now, maybe because it's a longer and more, more matured in terms of how it is and more global, okay, over time. Now, but there is the issue of awareness to start with. One of the young African entrepreneurs who came to this conference, we were in another session about yesterday, as they were mentioning this particular organization, he was tweeting to about 27 different people who should know. Only 2 of them had heard of the organization. So the point I'm trying to make is this. I mean, it's not a thing of, whose fault is it or whose fault is it not. It's just a thing we need to just go to an awareness building strategy. We need to then go quickly to identifying institutions within those regions. And I'm not just talking about Africa. I mean, at George Mason, I traveled around the world. I went to South America and everywhere. I think we need to systematically, identify those core organizations that have the resources and the skill sets to help broker this kind of, and break the logjam. And even if we have to make progress in just incremental steps, it means a lot. But I think, that strategy of what we are doing right now with, like I said, with the partnership that I just mentioned, we have a separate partnership on just the issue of cybersecurity with George Mason University. And that is working very well. Again, the same structure, but that is more bilateral and it's not, multi, But there, even so, we still we insist on this multi-stakeholder, even if it's just 2 academic institutions that are organizing it. We insist on really drawing in a lot of, this model that ISOC and IGF and all of the new concept now of this multi-stakeholder approach. So I think there are ways we can begin to make. It's not just gonna make earth-shattering changes, but at least in incremental steps we can begin to move toward a difference. So that when we sit here in the next year, 2 years, we are not singing the same song.
Here.
So one small follow-up question. You put a lot of focus on getting universities involved, and I think that would be a good thing. What I have seen in the IETF happening, I'm not 100% sure at the current situation, but several years ago when I was area director in the operations and management area, that specifically in Germany, universities were not rating contributions to IETF as much as they did to academic papers like to IEEE, various magazines in IEEE. So if the students had actually publications in those magazines, they were much better rated in their CVs and in their resumes than, for example, contributing to an IETF RFC. Actually, to get an RFC out is kind of hard if you come in new, depending on what area you're working in. But an internet draft does really not count that much in the academic community, I think.
This exercise is not for the purpose of the universities themselves, churning out academic papers. That's not, and that's why again, you need to. The collaboration up front has to define its own goals. In our own case, really the emphasis has never been on the publication of papers that will end up in journals and that sort of thing. No. What we have succeeded in doing, for example, is in identifying or incentivizing those that we see around us. In Nigeria, I have discovered so many young talents. So many not so young talents, diaspora folks who have come back, but before we got to them, they just sort of were vegetating in terms of this intellectual and resource skill they brought back, right? Because there was no central place, there was no place to really focus that energy. So now they see somebody or a group of people who are saying, hey, there is a channel here, there is a need over here, and you have the right skill sets, or at least you have the basis of it. And we can help improve those skill sets. Each of these groups here, I found out, have even, they have programs, really, that they're looking for people to give those programs to. They can't find the right, folks to do that with. So I'm saying we are really looking at scanning the community, the environment, to see who are the kinds of people that can now begin to increase these numbers. The people that can actually begin to write, and maybe under somebody will be coaching them and under some kind of guidance, which is the way it happens all over the world. But somehow you have to stimulate the environment. You have to incentivize, the community you want to tap from. So that's really what I'm talking about.
There's a question in the back.
Yes, my name is Boris Engelson. I am a local journalist, freelancer, and you will not be surprised to hear that I am not quite sure what we are discussing here, but I'll still try to bring my own positive input, and I will try to rephrase from a purely user's point of view, media user point of view, the issue of ingredients and standards for the future of the internet. First, to have standards, to develop standards and have using ingredients for the future, we must not only have standards and ingredients, but we must also have a future. What I mean is that what future we wanted before the advent of the net was very clear. In those days, there were just the old telcos allowing communication between one person and another person, and there was the voice of the state called the national television, top down, and in the best case, we could have a microcomputer to prepare our home month budget. And the dream was to integrate that and introduce interactivity and multiply the number of individual or community actors. What is today our vision of what we expect of the future? The closer we come to the future, the less future there is left. So we don't really know what we suffer from today that we want to improve and overcome to create a better and perfect internet. There remains still to make implants directly in the brain, and this will be total internet paradise, and you know that paradise doesn't change. There is no time in paradise. It's always paradisiac. So we first must have a clear idea what kind of future we expect. And this is where it's a mixture, the fact that the...
Okay, can you make it a little more crisp? Or
quite. That's where precisely there is still a future to be invented, but apparently not within your bodies of standards. Because what is the number one standard of mankind? It is probably the language, the vocabulary, the alphabet. And this comes to the point of why is there no, for instance, IFLA representative at this table? In fact, IFLA, the International Federation of Librarian Association, has very little to say on that, but they are wrong. There was a time when there was one basic standard of culture
question is what?
And communication. Pardon me?
Your question is what?
My question is, first, what vision of the future you have, since the future has already arrived? And secondly, what is the interaction between, since one of you spoke of the importance of human-to-human communication, that everything could be solved by a telephone call. Yes, between bureaucrats that can be solved, but with mankind it can't, because precisely...
Okay, so let me get a response to your question.
Yeah, I have not finished to phrase my question, but, question cannot be... issue cannot be raised if you don't find the right vocabulary for that.
You have been talking for the last 5 minutes.
Pardon me?
You've been talking for the last 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'd like to get a response to your question.
Good.
Okay, Steve, could you comment on the vision?
No, it's kind of challenging. My first thought is not to try to engage in trying to predict the future. That's a flawed challenge. But maybe it's not quite so hard. there's certainly parts of the future that we can see relatively clearly, and there are parts that we know we can't see, and there are parts that we don't know at all. So the safe part of this is the parts that we can see fairly clearly. We know we're going to be dealing with a wider range of transmission technologies, for example, which are going to stress the limits of speed and delays and so forth. So there's going to be a whole area of complexity there to be worked out. We know something about the applications that are going to come along. I've been watching speech and speech understanding in particular for a long time, and that's been just around the corner for the last 30, 40 years, and probably will be it's evolving, but probably won't be settled for some good long time. So, and I don't want to sort of take too much time, but one can lay out broad areas where there's going to be evolution, and there has to be some harmonization of the different approaches. So that's my view.
Let me turn to you on this. You have kind of a different perspective coming from developing
if I'm going to attempt to answer that question, I'd rather not go on the sort of philosophical journey of sort of what is this life, and what is the future going to be. I'd rather just look at what is the future that we all, or that I hope for in terms of the global internet that we are talking about here. From that standpoint, I would say that I see, or I hope for a future that allows for more communication between people, especially in the developing world now. I mean, I have seen that. I live both in Washington and in Abuja. It's when I go to my home in Washington, it's a whole different experience. I mean, what I can do with the internet, broadband, all of those things, and I sort of take it for granted. And I watch my kids, who are not so young anymore, but I watch them do amazing things, and I can see where we are today, and I can imagine what the future would be like. Then the next week I am in Nigeria, and then it's different, frankly, when I'm, say, within the confines of Digital Bridge Institute, where we've taken pains to really create an environment, and the rest of Abuja, not to talk about now when I go to the rural areas where the people really live. Okay, so my own hope for the future is that some of those things that I'm able to do in Virginia, that at least the people in those rural areas are able, they have the tools, not to do the same things, because they're probably not going to do the same things. They really have their own, we have things within the village setting and all that people would like to do, which are not dictated by anybody coming from anywhere to tell them. Just so you give them the tools, they decide what they want to do with it. That's really the future that we're looking at. And from that standpoint, it's difficult to then predict what is going to come off life from that standpoint. I mean, what are you going to do with, if you had limitless access, broadband access, for example, in your, I don't know exactly where you live, but what are you going to do with it? What is the village man, woman, or child going to do with it? How would they reconstruct their own lives if they had the choice to do that? Well, so two things would happen. One is access to the global knowledge, collective knowledge that's been gathered, on this thing called the global internet. But then the second is the content that they, just for now suppressed, but it's there, and if they had the tools and they know how to put those things up there, we would all be amazed at what this collective knowledge from these unserved communities would contribute to the betterment of our own existence. This is really the way I look at it.
Hey, Stephen, you wanted to?
Yes. I personally think, from a more pragmatic point of view, that the future is that global markets are going to drive more and more the adoption of standards. Those standards are going to be standards that the consumer chooses through the products that they buy. And we, as a community, need to understand that, recognize it, and embrace it, because that is our future. My job in the context of everything that we need to do for the internet is quite simple. Get the bits on the wire and get them off the wire, and do that as expeditiously and as efficiently as possible. So what we need to do is understand the requirements moving into the future. And I don't think that's a long-term, it's a long-term vision, but I don't think you do it based on a long-term understanding. It's an evolution. These markets are so powerful that they drive innovation. It's the market that's pushing the technologists to deliver the best technology that they can. And in order to do that, they have to very quickly invent that technology. It doesn't exist today. So I think the future, at least at the level that we work at in the IEEE, is that we just keep on driving as hard as we can to get the best technologies we can as quickly as we can and productize them in a cost-effective way so that the internet can grow at a faster and faster pace into the future.
I think the biggest, highest granularity answer to your question is found in the IETF's mission statement. That is, we make the internet work better. So what does that mean for the near term and the long term? First is about a third of the planet's population is able to access the internet today. So scale to the rest of the planet is clearly part of that vision. And we don't have the addresses with IPv4 to make that happen. So clearly the transition to IPv6 is part of that. Improve security, improve privacy, better support for mobility, reducing the power consumption. These are all problems that fall within that vision. The IETF right now has 120 working groups working on various aspects of making the internet work better. And I'm sure that if you look back the last 5 years, that number has been very stable. When we close one, we open another. There's enough topics on making the internet work better that I suspect when we look 5 years forward, there'll be about 120 problems that we're working on in various aspects of making the internet work better.
Question over here.
Good morning. My name is Anais Canfer. I'm a student of the Graduate Institute in Geneva. I'm not an expert on internet technologies, but I'm doing a research on the inclusion of the Global South in the internet. So I have three specific questions. The first one would be, what is the importance of having open internet standards for the Global South for developing countries? The second one is, okay, so now they can access these standards, but is that enough? What other obstacles are there to fight for this access to all the population? And finally, in relation to the comment about the markets, what happens to the bottom people that cannot actually have the resources to be involved in the markets? How can the internet can also take into account their needs? Thank you.
I want to start with the last question that you asked, and that is the concept of markets. Again, that is something I've had to grapple with. That wearing one hat, I think in terms of markets, because I'm in communities where people, it's a business roundtable and it's a business this and it's a business that. Wearing the other hat is more a development perspective. I give you an example. One of the research interests I've had since I went to the Digital Bridge Institute is the question of how we can harness the internet as it is today, and with the conditions we have in Nigeria today, to educate the nomadic people within Nigeria. We have a fairly huge nomadic population. That's the kind of population you're talking about. When I'm dealing with that question, I can't think in terms of markets. Okay. And yet this is a very critical issue for the country. Why is that so? Because for those of you who don't know, the nomadic population include different groups, but the largest of them is people who rear cattle. And so they move from one part of the country, usually from the north, down to the south, depending on the time of year. And what they're concerned about is the survival of the cattle. So they move there on the go. The only way, and because they're on the go, they're usually outside the political process. And the real issue now is how do we harness all of these qualities of the internet to bring this group into the political process? Not just the political process, economic survival, and all of those other things that the rest of the citizens enjoy. So, question, how do I use the internet and the existing technology to educate this group? Okay. And I have tried to collaborate with professors from here, there, and yonder. And frankly, the technology is not mature enough to answer my question today. Now you look at it from a standards building perspective. Some of you here will probably say, what's the problem? I mean, we have this and we have that. But it's a combination of things. One is that, and I'm talking about in that particular environment. We don't have, in Nigerian context, we have, yes, big submarine cables are now landing, but by and large, we don't have broadband yet. Such that it can serve in the way many of you might be thinking the solution in your heads. Two, even the bandwidth that we have right now is so expensive that you really cannot, it's not viable for the kinds of problem that I am pointing out now. The fact that they are moving means that it limits the kind of technology. You can't start talking to me about cyber cafes and that sort of thing. Probably the only solution we're talking about is mobile phones, which most of them have now. Okay, but now the question is, what is the technology? Just think of it, those of you who are technical. What is the technology that would lead me from point A to point Z in terms of the problem I just presented to you? That becomes a problem. Now, yes, it becomes a state program. It has to be sort of a state program. Yeah, it has to be a state program, and so there are those kind of technological and not non-technological barriers that we have to overcome. That's just one problem. I have several research problems of that sort. Let me just leave the other questions for some of the others.
Okay. So, somebody else want to comment on this? Stephen, and then Steve. Go ahead.
So a couple of things that maybe just in closing, I think it's fair to speak for both my colleague on my left and I that the processes that we use within our respective standards organizations are borderless, and they attempt to be all-inclusive. And we welcome anyone from anywhere in the world. I've talked to Raymond a bit, and I think I think education or training, if you will, is important. And I think it's important in the context of your question too. Standards are a vehicle through which we deliver technology to the marketplace. And the reason we use standards is to get the consistency and commonality that we need in order to ensure those markets are as big as they can possibly be, which alternatively delivers value to industry and ultimately resulting in value to the end user. So it's societal value. And if you look at the tagline for the IEEE, it's advancing technology for humanity. I deeply believe in that. And ultimately that's the goal, and I think that's a shared goal. Deliver the best technical solutions which result in improving the life of everybody on this planet. And of course we can't get everybody all at one time. We have to continue to strive to expand. So from a market point of view, I would view situations such as the ones that Raymond articulated as, you know, future build-out opportunities for us to continue to grow and expand the markets in order to include those people.
Okay, Steve, before I turn the mic to you, let me get in here. I think there is a great example of the kind of thing that you're talking about happening today in Western Kenya. Do you know who the Maasai are? The Maasai are a nomadic people that migrate between Kenya and Tanzania. And they have actually stopped and built a town for the purpose of educating their children. And so they contract for bandwidth from Kenya Telecom, and that comes in through an ad hoc network that connects some 15 schools around this town. And they've moved from basically a girl in a Maasai community is used to tend cows. And they, at this point, have several women that are in medical school in Chicago as a result of a distinct effort to use technology, use internet access to provide education to their children. Okay, so putting together standards and driving the cost out of them by standardizing things, they've actually become available and been able to generate some value in places like that. Now, Steve, you wanted to get in.
First of all, I have to compliment you and applaud your three-part question. It gets to very important phases of the whole process, and there isn't a single answer that covers all of that because it's too broad and the solutions are sort of different for each part of it. The part that I'm particularly want to comment in is the first part of the importance of open standards. When we set about to try to write down thoughts about first the ARPANET and then the Internet, it felt very natural to make the standards completely open. No cost to get the standards, no cost to participate, wide open participation and everything. The impact of that has been far larger than certainly I first thought about. The context in which we were building the original network was all within the U.S. and some of the concerns we were concerned about were the bureaucratic difficulty of getting approvals to send things out of institutions if they were declared to be formal publications. We wanted a much lighter weight, much faster process. 25 years later, I made my first trip to India, somewhat late. I should have gone much earlier. And I was introduced to a graduate student in Bangalore who had built some fairly interesting software. I talked to him and listened to what he did, and I was quite impressed with the range of things that he was able to put together. And so I asked him how he did that, and he said, well, I just read the RFCs, downloaded the RFCs, read them, and built all this stuff. This may be the first time I've been able to say that without choking up. It really got to me. The enormous power of the fact that that information is available freely around the world to anybody is an enormous enabler and really cuts down on the drag. So I'm strongly in favor of open standards. I recognize that it runs counter from a revenue model point of view, and so that's worthy of some discussion. It's not the only discussion about how the Internet destroys revenue models, and this is just one more.
So we're coming close to the end of this particular panel, but we had a comment that came in from the wires.
Yes, there is a question from Kesarayu from India. Human knowledge collaboration is required to create new internet. Information should change to knowledge, which will help people to survive. And the question is how this can be achieved. And there is another comment statement, and he would like also to to learn about your thoughts of the new model. Today, internet is becoming junk. Not big data moves internet knowledge. Commerce and knowledge bartering should happen through internet. And his view is the next. Internet should evolve as an intelligent process, net where people barter their knowledge for survival. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Let's get a couple of comments quickly on this, and then we'll need to move to the next panel. So who wants to address it? Go for it.
So I'm not sure I got the whole thing, but the knowledge piece I think is absolutely spot on. It's as we evolve, I think we need to think about better ways to turn the information and data that we have into usable knowledge, and I think that's just a whole new area of opportunity that can be built on top of the internet. So I would support that concept. I can't really say that I have some good ideas on how to get there, but I will tell you that one of the things that the IEEE is constantly looking at is, they've got something on the order of 3 million documents in their library now. How can they use that vast repository of information to deliver more in the way of knowledge than is involved in any one of those articles?
Okay, yeah, so let me wind up just with a thought in response to that, and then we'll move along. The internet and communications in general reflect the society that use them. It seems to me that we find very good things on the internet. We find pornography, we find outright crime, we find attacks. And they reflect the society in which we live and the people that we are. To expect that the communications on the internet are going to be better than our society is perhaps a vain hope. But at the same time, I think it's a challenge to us to find ways to improve ourselves as a people and as a society and move in a direction that's going to be more constructive and more useful. So I think the call there is not technological. I don't think you can fix society technologically, but to actually improve the society in which we live. So with that, let me thank the panel that we've had and invite the new one to come up, and we'll move along. So. Globalization of that process. Now the question becomes, how do we use them? How do we deploy them? So what Leslie wrote in the webpage was DNSSEC, IPv6, and new GTLDs are a few of the standards and technologies involved in the long collaborative process that takes the world from design to deployment. This part of the session will address the challenges of working in an environment where participation is open to all technical experts and standards-based deployments are voluntary while meeting the needs of diverse users in the evolving network. What are the challenges for the multi-stakeholder community in advancing technological deployments? How do we detect consensus on new protocols and across a range of voices? And how do we promote technology updates imperative to the health of the network when they lack a clear short-term business mandate or rationale? So we have a number of panelists here. And once again, let me ask you to introduce yourselves and tell me who you are, what you represent, and give us an opening statement. What do you believe?
I guess we go from left to right or from right to left, depending on where you're sitting and how you're looking.
Tall to short.
Tall to short, no. My name is Olaf Kolkman. I'm director of NLnet Labs. NLnet Labs is a not-for-profit research and development foundation, and we we're chartered to work on open standards and open source software for the good of the internet. And what we're looking at are those technologies that make the network of networks an internet. So we're looking at this big thing on which people can connect, and we're actually looking at what is inside of that. Innovation on the internet, the things that have made the internet great, are possible because you can hook up to that internet without having special knowledge about what is what its intern structure is. That made things like Facebook happen. That made stuff like Wikipedia happen. Building blocks were on the stack. There was no need of knowing what the network looked like and how you could hook up to things. What we're interested in is how can you innovate inside that network? What are the difficulties? If you want to introduce things like security, how can you do that? And what we're trying to do there is participate by doing. Actually, you know, getting our hands dirty by developing software, helping to think along on how to standardize it and how to deploy that software. And I believe that if you talk about beliefs, I believe that we can maintain an internet that is open, to which people can hook up, and that is my goal. But in order to do that, we also need to innovate in the core of the network, and we need to make it more secure. And those are big challenges.
Thank you. My name is Alexa Raad. I am CEO of a now 1.5-year-old startup called Architelos. Prior to that, I was CEO of .org for about 3.5 years, and it was during that time that we implemented DNSSEC, and I believe that I'm here to be the business person foil for my two technical colleagues, so I'll be playing the devil's advocate from time to time. We had a discussion yesterday regarding what do we believe, because ultimately we felt that there are two classes of belief. On the one hand, you could believe that the world is a zero-sum game, and so that then determines your set of actions going forward, meaning the competition, the essence of collaboration is going to be lost on somebody who believes that this is a zero-sum game, because the more that you gain, the less somebody else does. I'm of the opposite camp, and I think my fellow panelists are also of the opposite camp, where we believe that the world is not a zero-sum game, but rather the more that you increase the pie, even if through collaboration or through competition, the more there is for you. I also I believe in collective wisdom. In fact, that's actually the mission of my new company, enabling collective wisdom in the service of the internet. I also believe that the best way to fail is try to please everybody. So collaboration doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to bring down a consensus down to the lowest common denominator. That sometimes tough compromises have to be made in the name of consensus, but doesn't mean everybody's going to have to agree on every point. And I don't know what success is, but I think the key to failure is you failed when you've started to blame somebody else. So it's accountability, it's collaboration and accountability, being able to step up and say when something is not working, and be able to take accountability for that and accountability for fixing it.
Thank you. I am Adiel, Akplogan. I'm the CEO of AfriNIC. AfriNIC is the Internet Number Registry for Africa region. Africa region means the continent plus Indian Ocean. I am on this panel mainly because of my role and also because of the role that the organization I'm leading is playing on the continent. We, as a registry, a regional registry for IP address, we commit to promote internet development, internet usage, internet culture in our region, where sometimes we have to push for technology like IPv6, which in first view doesn't have any business rationale, any business value. When in 2004 we start our first IPv6 training in Africa, most comment that we have received from people is, why are you talking about IPv6 when you are not even not using IPv4 that you have yet? But we continue this effort voluntarily by putting the emphasis on the fact that the internet is global, and all standards and the technology by itself follow a culture that is based on collaboration. And if we left ourselves out of this paradigm, we'll find ourselves isolated. What I believe in, I fundamentally believe in the power of open, collaborative effort for public and common goal or interest in general. I say public and common because it can be public but not common. It can be common but not public. So collaboration has to lead us to work together for common interest, and that is not always obvious. But if we look closely at the past few years' development of technology, that is the only way, really, to get the best of everybody with the hope that it will serve in one way or another everybody putting their effort on the plate. Because if we don't have that collaboration and the interest, the public interest in mind, we won't be able to work together. And that has been my belief for the past almost 20 years now, when I engage myself to promote internet in my region and get this culture, because beside the technology, it's a culture of collaboration, it's a culture of common interest within my community, so that we really embrace internet as a development and a socio-economic enhancement tool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let me go into this question of deployment. I'm thinking of, we've mentioned in the lead-in IPv6 and DNSSEC, we were talking yesterday about the development of the bits and pieces that became the elements of the Wikipedia. And there's simple ones like ingress filtering, where we have attacks in the network that people use spoofed addresses in order to perpetrate part of the attack. And just getting people to turn on simple filters to make sure that nobody's sending spoofed addresses around. And that's actually been hard, because people say, well, that helps everybody else, but it doesn't help me, so why should I do it? What are the issues that we're looking at in deployment? How do we get people to turn things on when it's the right thing to do, but there's no obvious business rationale? Who wants to go at that?
Well, that's the most difficult question. I now remember that I once listened to a keynote somewhere given by you, Fred, which was about the tragedy of the commons. And this type of deployment where we actually look at the internet as a network of networks, where the benefits are not directly for the individual networks, the individual telcos, the individual access providers, the individual transfer providers. Where those benefits are not directly obvious, it's very hard to get deployment. The example that you gave, which in the industry is known as BCP38 filtering, but basically which means that the traffic that comes from your network is supposed to come from your network, and there's no other traffic originating from that, is a fairly simple technical measure, but it's not being done generally, which leads to DOS attacks and overall decrease of stability of that whole internet, the internet as a whole. And nobody wants to take the first step there. And the same goes for deployment of IPv6. Why should I, as an individual network operator, deploy the IPv6? There's nobody who will look at the content that I serve on IPv6. In fact, if I serve it on IPv6, somebody at the other side of the planet might be less competent in deploying it, and I might run into problems and they don't access my content in a proper way or not fast enough or what have you. So there's actually risks involved. Same goes with the deployment of DNSSEC. Why should you deploy DNSSEC if there is the opportunity that the system gets more fragile? Those are difficult questions. Why should you do it? Because you improve that network as a whole. IPv6 is necessary to move to new generations of internet users, to move to the next 4 or 5 billion people, to those 4 or 5 billion people having 6 devices on their body alone that are connected to the network. If we don't move there and we get stuck in the present, then, we cannot innovate anymore. There's not going to be this next person that connects to that internet with great ideas and constructs the new Facebook, the new Google. Same goes with DNSSEC deployment, which has been designed, sorry, I'm taking a little bit long time, but it has been designed as a security feature. But if you look at that security feature, which is slowly beginning to deploy, then now people see the opportunity to actually innovate based on that little building block. So not only does it buy you security of the DNS itself, it buys you trustworthiness of the DNS, the phone book of the internet, that you can now use to build other security structures on it. There's a technical development going on right now. It's being standardized in the IETF. It's called DANE. If that catches on, it's going to change the way we do security on the internet. So, while you may not have immediate benefit by deploying technologies like BCP38, like DNSSEC, like IPv6, you're actually taking a public responsibility in moving the network forward. And how to get that across is a very difficult message, and I don't know how to make it.
Yeah, I think you touched the very critical point. How do we move from what we, from technical community, we design to the operation where there is no value in that? And that bring me back to the title of this panel, which is the collaboration aspect. How can we look at that word, collaboration, at the design aspect to ensure that in the implementation of the operation side, we have people see more value in deploying this. Because as I said before, internet is a technology, but it's a culture. It's a culture of people who get together to collaborate to create a new technology that is based on shared responsibility. So how can we bring the capacity of everybody that is involved with the development of the technology to that same level of shared responsibility, being from the business sector, being from the public sector, being from the technical area, having the same understanding of the shared responsibility, which is at the core of the protocol itself. Because probably if we manage, and maybe that will be the discussion, to bring that same understanding for different stakeholders involved in the deployment or in the development of technology, maybe we have make progress, because then the economical value will not be the only reason for adopting a technology, but we will look more into the global interest, and that each of us share a responsibility on the safety and on the development of the internet.
I want to pick up on what my two colleagues said. Two themes emerge. One, that the benefit does not accrue necessarily to the early adopter. or to the early implementer. That the benefit of implementing some of these building blocks ultimately accrue to the next generation, if you will, who is then able to innovate and build on top of it. Case example, Wikipedia. Second is the idea of motivation. What motivates you? And, you know, we also, even though we believe in what we stated earlier, we're also realistic enough to know that the motivation that we have is not necessarily shared across. And the real world example is with DNSSEC implementation, one of the key building blocks were the registrars. And the registrars were very, very opposed to DNSSEC because it provided a known cost, an unknown benefit. So if you look at, there's a concept, you know, tipping point concept, right? And regardless of whether it's an idea or whether it's an adoption, whether it is a technology, it seems to have the same type of graph. And there's various segments. First segment is early adopter. The motivations for early adopters are very different. It's 2.5%. The 2.5% will do things because they're the guys who stand in line to buy the first iPhone, stand in line and sleep outside the Apple store. Their motivation is, and they'll pay the higher prices, and they know that this product could have bugs, right? Their motivation is different than, you know, the grandmother who gets the iPhone because everybody else has it. So understanding the motivation. Early adopters' motivations are, if you can identify who they are, and in the successful cases, you know, we've identified who the early ones are and who are willing to take the higher risk, the known cost, without understanding that the benefit will not accrue to them and that they're doing it for the public benefit. Then you won't get to the tipping point until you get to 28%. 28% of the market. However, or your audience, whoever it is. So once you get to 28%, then you've now reached the point where everybody else, so I'll use the case of the registrars as an example. We had registries, early adopters. Once one registry implemented, other registries had to start to compete, so they announced that they were going to implement. Now, all of a sudden, some registrars, for them, it became a competitive necessity. So they were not in the early adopters, they were in now the early majority, right? And so once one or two of the large registrars started to say that they would support it because of competitive necessity, their competitors, the late majority, started to make plans to implement. So point is, understanding the value, understanding that your values are not necessarily shared, therefore understanding the motivations and how adoption takes place is a realistic and practical way of targeting who you want to start picking this up and then actually having a roadmap for adoption.
So I find myself thinking about two things. One is my mom. She started using the internet, started using electronic mail in 1992, which I think makes her an early adopter. But the reason that she gave for doing so was that she discovered that her grandchildren would respond to emails. And it had nothing to do with, oh gee, let's play with this cool toy. It had everything to do with that which was important to her. The other thing I think about, I think was the second time that I had been to China. I had a meeting with a vice minister and a whole bunch of other people. And we were talking about, among other things, what would be interesting to China in standards and why should China branch beyond its own borders and send engineers to work in the internet. And I suggested to this vice minister that if I were Chinese, there were two things that I would be interested in. One of them was domain names and characters that weren't ASCII. And the other was having enough addresses for 1.3 billion people. He turned to Paul Wilson and I, and Paul is with APNIC for those of you that don't know, and said, okay, so IPv6 deployment is really, really simple. You put together a 5-year plan, shoot anybody that's in the way, and turn it on. You know, why haven't you done this? And Paul and I looked at each other, and he said, why don't you answer it? So I said, well, Mr. Vice Minister, sir, there's this market thing. And he laughed, and at that point I knew that he spoke English. And he said, oh, we understand markets, and we in China will make this happen. And of course, China has been among the forefront countries in moving toward IPv6. But it's a matter of addressing issues that are important to them. So, okay, how do we take these things and make them visible as something that addresses a human need? How do we move ahead with that?
Well, I want to maybe not answer that question, but I was thinking.
Take the question, answer it.
No, well, let me think of a question. The topic of this particular piece of the panel is how does collaboration play a role in this? And that was the sort of example I was thinking about. If you look at early DNSSEC deployment, what happened there was that the very early players, the people who were involved in developing, I'm going to do a step back. There was a failure in DNSSEC deployment, and that was in essence that that collaboration didn't happen early enough. Just to give a timeline of DNSSEC deployment. DNSSEC deployment happened when in, I believe, 86 or so, Steve Bellevin wrote a paper and said this DNS thing is very vulnerable. That was the Kaminsky attack, which he wrote down. Everybody now knows the Kaminsky attack, but that was it. He wrote it down in 86. People realized something needed to be done. Some specialist on DNSSEC and cryptography went into a room, wrote a spec. They improved the spec, they pushed it to the market, and in early 2000, a lot of people thought, oh, the specification is done. It's implemented, it lives in software, we can deploy it. And at that moment, the true collaboration between the protocol designers and the people who actually operate started to work. And we collectively discovered this thing doesn't work. We cannot give this protocol and this software implementation to the business because it doesn't fit the business dynamics. It doesn't fit the business needs. And at that time, the business, the registries, were suddenly interested in making this thing actually work. And they participated in the interaction and the collaboration to do the standards. And that is a fairly slow process because you have to go through this development circle, implementation circle, deployment circle, learn from it and turn back. But it's very important that that type of interaction is happening. And even today, if we look at DNSSEC, the interactions are happening. We see new groups of people joining in the efforts of rolling out, and they identify new problems. And then there are collaborative forums like the DNSSEC deployment group, the IETF. There's collaborative forums where people actually try to solve the problems that they mutually have. They try to develop BCPs and so on and so forth. A similar story. I'm at a spree here. A similar story can be told about IPv6. IPv6 was done 20 years ago. It was finished. It was done. The expectation was it was to be deployed in parallel with IPv4. Well, nobody did that. And then a few years ago, I think not 3-4 years ago, people actually started to do commercial deployments of IPv6 and ran into problems. How to do this in a serious business. And what you see now is that Early deployers like Comcast in the US have shared their experiences back with the community. This is the type of problem we run into. And they share it with the community, and that actually helps progress. So businesses that make their hands dirty is what drives this industry. Learning by doing and sharing the experience, not keeping it to yourself. Because with these network of network things, the competitive benefit is not there when you do it by yourself. The competitive benefit starts to emerge when many people do it. So you better share the mistakes you made.
Okay. You want to add to that?
I sucked all the air out of the room.
I mean, I think you did a good job of answering. I'm not sure what more that I can add.
Well, so you went through the experience with the registrars and convincing them that it was the right thing to do. And you had people offering to, sorry, you had people offering to not support.org, and that changed. What did you do?
I'll tell you two learnings. We talked about this a little bit yesterday regarding coalition, and then I'll talk about the registrars. I wanted to put together a coalition, and so I went out and talked to a couple of organizations, got their C-levels committed, and I thought, this is great. Commitment from the C-level, assign somebody, come to the meeting. And we decided we were going to have, working groups for outreach, for implementation, for the registrars, create a registrar development handbook that was common across the registries. And what happened was, not much happened. And the reason is that they came into it with some, first of all, it wasn't their, they didn't self-volunteer, they were appointed. And they came into it with some reminders, make sure you get NDAs in place. Make sure you can share this, but you can't share that. Anything that was developed had to go back to the home office, And so that really slowed down. So we changed tactics. And I instead went after people that I knew were very dedicated, really believed in what we were trying to accomplish, and had specific skills. For example, the key thing was to understand how are we going to, when the registrar says, what do I have to do? What are we going to tell them? And a barrier to the registrar was, well, you mean I have got to do this for every registry, so I've got to now incur the same cost but 5 different times. And so how could we solve that? And so by having this be grassroots, in other words, not top-down, but I hate to use the word bottom-up because it's so often used, but have it be grassroots and people who really wanted to give their time and who already had thought about the issue, and having an informal kind of meeting in a hotel lobby at ICANN, that actually started a lot of the communication and phone calls and back and forth, and having them enlist other people, and that was very, very helpful. With the registrars, a comment I often hear is people don't, there was no need, there's no market need, there's no market need. That to me is, it just kind of gets my blood boiling, because how do you know what the market need is? And how does a customer know what they need? And in fact, I was using the example of having a meeting with one of the registrars who was telling us that they were, this was so egregious and they were going to pull back. And this was when iPads had just come out. And I'd not seen one, and he had it. And I said, oh, is that a new, iPad? And he said, yes, why? I said, well, did you call Apple and tell them you wanted one? Did you tell him that it had to be like this with a touchable screen? And he goes, no, I don't understand what you mean. I said, well, you can't expect your customers to call you up and say, I want DNSSEC. Customers don't know what they want. What they want is they want to be able to communicate. These needs are inherent and they're timeless. They want to be able to communicate, they want to be able to congregate, and they want to be able to do this securely. How you do it, and they want to be entertained. How you do it, what product you do it with, doesn't matter. It's changed throughout the ages. So don't expect people to call you up and say, I want this technology, I want this IPv6. They want the benefits, and they'll recognize the benefits when they see it.
Yes, yeah, I mean, the aspect of the impact of market in deploying technology or new technology is important, and the interpretation we give to the market may also differ from a region to another, because when I take a region like developing countries, and specifically Africa, I mean, there are so many factors and data that will show that the market doesn't exist for anything. I mean, when mobile technology started in Africa, I mean, nobody expects this huge take-up that we are seeing today. Same thing for the internet. So what really is the market? How can we quantify the market when we don't really know how people will react? This led me to another approach in a community-driven process like what we are talking about here. And I think from what my two colleagues talked about before, there is one thing that come up is a champion in a community-driven process. I mean, there is always a need to find a champion to take up on something new and agree to take the risk, to sacrifice his time, to sacrifice the market, to sacrifice everything, and engage himself in what he's doing. And if we take the example of IPv6, which is something that we have been very active in our region, if we look at the story of promoting IPv6 for the past 5 years, 6, even 10 years, we can see that the shift, we can see a shift in the message that we are giving to the community about how do we make sure that IPv6 is deployed or people start deploying IPv6. We start by saying, okay, this will happen systematically, or operators will deploy IPv6 because they will plan ahead, they will see that, well, IPv4 is not going far, we will need IPv6. But they haven't done it. Then we start thinking, okay, what can we do? Forums start popping up, task force start popping up, where people start thinking about what we can do with IPv6. So trying to find something that can encourage champions to come on. And recently, we start seeing another school of thought where there is a need for instance, government to champion this, not by regulating, but by leading the efforts, by providing an environment which will encourage operators to do the right thing. So I think the need to find champion is probably critical from the design. We already have the technical community championing this, but when it goes to the implementation side, we need to find the right champion that can voluntarily, without expecting a market review return, engage into this. And probably that is where we can also reflect what is the role of different stakeholders or different parties in this kind of environment, which is open, cooperative, and bottom-up.
So I just had it pointed out to me that the chairman of the Dutch IPv6 task force is sitting in the room. I just wonder if he has anything to say here.
Thank you for,
Eric.
for drawing me into this discussion. My name is Erik Huizer. I'm indeed chairman of the Dutch IPv6 task force and have been so for the last 6 years already. It's not uncommon for me to meet people when I tell them this to say, well, then you have failed if you haven't managed in 6 years to make sure that IPv6 is running in the Netherlands. The big problem, of course, here is, as with DNSSEC, is that a lot of people don't realize that we are trying to change something in infrastructure here. And if you look at the hourglass model, and you understand the hourglass model, then you know that changing something at the application layer or changing something at the infrastructure layer, there's a big difference there. And the internet infrastructure, to change something there, it's really difficult, and Alexa is absolutely right that it's very difficult to get any customer here to say, this is what I need. Nobody in the Netherlands, if you approach him on the streets and you ask, are you using the internet? Yes. And the next question, do you need DNSSEC? Do you need IPv6? None of them will say yes. And the problem there is that we have a responsibility to make sure that DNSSEC and IPv6 will work, because if we don't, somewhere in the future, and it's very difficult to predict when and where, something will go wrong, and something will go terribly wrong, and then of course everybody will point their fingers at us. Why didn't you fix this in an earlier stage? So this is the problem I continuously run into. It's very difficult. You don't want to create like the year 2K problem, this incredible sense of urgency with all doom scenarios and stuff like that, because there is no hard deadline, neither for DNSSEC nor for IPv6. But on the other hand, you want to impress some urgency on everybody to start working on that. And so what we did in the Netherlands, we started at the ISP's first responsibility. All ISPs are now working on IPv6 or have it operational. And then we work from there out. We now have a team set on approaching all the government institutions, all major companies, and even do education at small and medium enterprises. So we work from the inside out to the outside in trying to get more knowledge about this and to increase the sense of urgency.
Okay, probably.
Okay, there's a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Let me pull that.
But it's already a different topic, not IPv6. So if you still want to stay on that topic, maybe the other question.
Well, I have a question on IPv6 and DNS as technologies, if you think that's appropriate. Well, thanks very much for sharing this experience. I mean, that's really great. This technology, both DNSSEC and IPv6, were around for quite some time. So, looking back, from your opinion, do you think we should have pursued a different strategy in deploying those technologies, if any strategy is possible? Do you think we should have made some different design choices in protocol design? Or do you think that's just a fact of life and the intrinsic quality of those technologies that, yeah, it takes time?
Yeah, it's incredible that we yesterday put into the Hall of Fame all those people who made those enormous mistakes in putting only 32 bits in an IP packet and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's a part of the answer. With IPv6 and DNSSEC both, with hindsight, yes, we could have done a better job. But with hindsight, that also depends on the early involvement of the people who have to put it into use, into the operational use. So that collaborative thing, that the collaboration between the people who design and the people who deploy, which, by the way, was part of that mindset more than 40 years ago. The people who designed were the deployers themselves. And now that, you know, over the last 40 years, that separation is. The people who deploy and build infrastructure are the people then the guys that sell it, and other people that do the design. So that collaboration is immensely important from the start. I think that we have a culture of collaboration. I think we have the institutions to do the collaboration, both on governance aspects as well as standardizations. But it's very hard to pull in the people in a timely fashion. So with hindsight, what would have I done better if I would be almighty? Pull in the people early, more early than we did. Because then we would have figured out that all those additions that we made with IPv6 on security and so on and so forth were much less important than, for instance, maintaining backward compatibility, which we didn't do.
Well, the problem there was IPv4 forward compatibility. IPv4 isn't compatible with anything else.
Fair enough. I mean, you know, a matter of perspective. But the point is the collaboration early on.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yes, and I think that is probably where I will really like this discussion to the direction to go. How can we improve that collaboration at the early stage? How can we prevent the market aspects that come very later to impact the deployment? And maybe by changing our communication and awareness about what we do at the core of the internet. How to enhance this understanding of collaboration at each level. At the technical level, we grow in that because implemented designer where they implemented that culture was there. Now it is separated. There are other people who implement. How can we increase the understanding of people who implement that we need them at the core at the design time so that they can give us real examples? How can we improve their participation in the collaborative? How can we improve the participation of people who will market the technology later at the early stage so that they probably give advice on which direction the design should go to make it more attractive at the level. So how can we review our message in terms of collaboration to make it more appealing for the different people involved in the role? Maybe that is where we have to reinvent ourselves at that point.
Okay, my name is Jani Waszkiewicz. I have a small software company, and my question is: you're talking a lot about collaboration, but how about collaboration tools? I mean, more precisely, in every community or organization, there are many tools used, and the knowledge and information is very scattered between social networks, maybe private social networks, then different databases for different projects, or wikis, or different websites, maybe video conferencing tools. And it's really a huge challenge to combine that knowledge together and use it to have like a common knowledge base. Do you see some promising trends in terms or tools to better combine knowledge inside communities or organizations? Thank you.
Do you see trends? Yes. If you see, let's have a look at this meeting. In this meeting we're not quite there yet, but we do have remote participation. If you look at collaborative platforms, they emerge in several, and they're scattered. Yes, they're scattered. The important part here is that those are tools for collaboration. And the tools need to hook up with the actual goal of the collaboration. It is already difficult enough to get the people from business, from manufacturing, from operations, from protocol design, to get them to collaborate. Now, I think that tooling does help there. Yeah, to me, those are applications to get something done, and I've seen amazing trends in that. I mean, we didn't have video conference possibilities 5 years ago, while we do have them now. And I think that the fora in which these collaborations take place need to make the utmost use of those tools and the tools that fit to their environment. But I'm not quite sure if I'm answering your question, though.
I think tools are just that, tools. You know, there's always going to be a variety of tools that are available, and they're always going to be better. But the tool, if it's not used, or if it's not used properly, it's a human element that's missing. And I think what you said, which resonated with me, was the goals of collaboration. You can provide the tools, you can start immediately on, great, you know, here's the things that we need to have as an outcome of, you know, collaborating. And my guess is you're probably not going to get too far. The key is to really understand, again, go back to the goals. Why are they collaborating? What do they hope to accomplish at a very high level? What is their motivation? If you've got people arranged in a room supposed to collaborate, one person's motivation is really to be able to compete better. The other person's motivation is really to try to, for public benefit. Until you actually understand and how to manage those goals and potentially separate them, no tool is really going to help.
That's true, and it's sort of unavoidable, but it's also so often the case that people want to collaborate, but that still the tools are missing, and also due to vendor lock-in, there's a problem with combining different tools. Yeah, thank you.
No, but you have a point there. Unfortunately, there are a bunch of open standards that do help in collaboration, and that we see become more popular. XMPP is an example. And hopefully HTML5 might open up things there too. I don't know. This is, you know, collaboration in that aspect is a very specific type of application, of course. To be honest, I had to think about Wikipedia. That Wikipedia is actually, the brightness of that is that it offered the perfect tool for the goal. The common goal was to enhance knowledge and share knowledge, and the wiki, the way that was structured and set up, was the perfect tool in order to do that. And I think that type of brightness will happen again in certain types of collaboration.
Okay, so let me take it here.
Thank you. My name is Ram Mohan. I'm EVP at Affiliates in the CTO. It appears to me that many of the solutions and thoughts suggested here perhaps are based on a requirement to have a traditional supply-demand system and where the community has an opportunity to participate. However, some of the countries with high adoption of IPv6 seem to not be in a market and or community-dominated system, but in somewhat more top-down systems. In the US, the government mandate to deploy DNSSEC seems to have changed the adoption curve. So, two questions for the panel. Do you have thoughts on sparking innovation using collaboration in places where the market is relatively undeveloped, including perhaps a not well-developed computing infrastructure itself, or where governments are unused or do not encourage a collaboration model? First question. Second question, regarding Adiel's point about champions and Alexa's point about first movers not getting advantages. Should the champions and first movers in such markets be subsidized, knowing that the first movers often do not reap many benefits?
Yeah, thank you. I think that those are sensible and deep questions. And that maybe come back to something else, which we said at the beginning, the shared responsibility that every stakeholder or every actor has on the development of the internet, not only on the running operational, but on its development globally. And while talking about country where there is no natural environment or framework or encouragement for collaboration, and that is in many developing countries. I mean, we live with that day to day. The framework doesn't exist. So people, and that's where sometimes I talk about cultural appropriation, because people are not used to collaborate, they are not used to discuss, to share. Can we add that aspect in how we define collaboration, or should we think about mechanism to allow those people, allow them to input in the system, even if it is not a full collaboration, but allowing them based on their local way of driving process to come in. For instance, in many developing countries, when you talk about IPv6 the development or IETF, by default, no one think about university, no one think about researcher, no one think about private sector. People think directly about government, because government in most of those countries are the one leading, deciding for everybody what, and that is part of the way. So should we help those government people who decide for the others to understand that they hold a responsibility to cooperate, to collaborate, to be part of where the discussions are happening, so that they can contribute? That is a way of contributing, because probably we may not succeed by willing at all costs to make people collaborate in those areas. So we will be missing one part of it by not reviewing that aspect. So that is probably a way of doing that, by identifying that collaboration doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. The second aspect, which is the champion, do the champion need to be subsidized? Do they need some support? Probably yes, because even if we look at the story of the US and the internet at the beginning, there has been a huge support from governments for the development of the protocol itself at some extent, and so maybe finding a mechanism to support that is needed, but convincing people to invest in that is another story. My belief, my personal belief, is that all those mechanisms are important, but and taking my personal experience, I think getting people to understand the collective responsibility on the internet, I think, is key. If people understand that what they do on the internet, how they contribute, how they participate, make what the internet is or what the internet will become, make how they will do business tomorrow, make how they will make money tomorrow, I think it will change their mindset on how they collaborate, probably, and be more volunteer to champion, even though they don't have immediate gain, but they can see far. But, well, it's open for
one additional thing. I'm not sure that just simply subsidizing the champion is going to it would help the champion, but it's not necessarily going to spark the next wave of adopters. One idea that I think governments could actually adopt is co-opetition. In other words, inviting not just the champion, but whoever joins that champion, and providing benefits that accrue the larger that group of competitors or that group of early adopters becomes. So again, going back to the idea that if you see, you've got to see this as an increasing pie. The more you invite, and the more companies, groups, adopters come in to help launch it, the greater the benefit to each of them individually and all of them collectively.
I heard, I might be answering a different question than Ram asked. There I go again. But I started out somewhere early in the session with talking about the tragedy of the commons. And when tragedy of commons happens, governments sometimes will step in. So it might be that there are governments in the world that step in more easier and leave things less to the market when a tragedy of the commons is about to happen. In the case of IPv6, that would take a very visionary government, I would think. There are roles in regulations that government can take by saying you need to deploy particular technology by date X or something, and that might have happened in cases. But there's also another role that the government can play in that, and that's being one of the partners in the collective responsibility. And that basically says that if the government wants to push a technology forward, it can lead by example. It can say we want to have all our government websites available on IPv6 by this date, and that's, that's under own control. The government said we'll have all .gov domain names signed by a specific date using DNSSEC. It's also an example that might not always be successful, specifically if that's by decree and not by also explaining why, what the motivations are behind such measures. We saw that in .gov people basically did the check mark turn on DNSSEC without understanding what they did, which was actually not that good. So some governments play an active role in pushing towards something. That's a culture, it's a cultural thing. So I can imagine that in different parts of the world, governments take different approaches to these type of public interest technologies. It's dangerous words, but.
So Rosa, I'd like to come to you.
Yes, my name is Rosa Delgado. I'm coming from Peru, and I joined the IPv6 task force in 2000 in the European task force, and actually in Europe we've been talking about IPv6 now for many years. The process hasn't been that fast. And you imagine if in Europe and developed countries the process is not that fast, and in emerging and developing countries will even taking longer. And I think there are measures or action that should be really taken in consideration. For example, if I see plans, a 5-year plan of a government, even if they're talking about IPv6, but I see the plan, a 5 years plan on telecommunication, on ICT, and they don't even mention IPv6. So, I mean, what is going to happen from now in 5 years if they haven't even included that in the projections, budget projections? The other thing is that how many universities are changing the curricula, how many students in emerging and developing countries having IPv6 on the curriculum, and I think not that many. So there are important actions to take. I agree we should continue talking about IPv6, marketing IPv6, because we need champion countries, champion leaders, because those people, even if they make mistakes, they learn from mistakes. But, I think to ensure that we have in the curriculum of universities, IPv6, DNSSEC, etc., this is an action. It should be, it should have more impact, and to really convince governments to have on the 5 years plan, on the 3 year plan, is really necessary. Thank you.
Yeah, I think she touched a point which again come back to the same understanding of where we are going. This is the academic sector, for instance, for university. Are they part of the whole process? Do they understand how IPv6, for instance, is impacting completely their curriculum on network design? Do they understand that people they are training today will be tomorrow's engineer, and they will be using only IPv6? Government not adding IPv6 to their strategic plan. Do they understand how IPv6 impacts their GDP? How it impacts the growth of telecommunication in their country tomorrow's? So those are things that can, as each actors can help completely change their approach, because they are part of the process and they got the right message right up front. It's not just a technology that is being designed, but it is a technology that its implementation, they hold a responsibility in its implementation. And I think we have to all at different level appropriate ourselves to that approach of collaboration, which goes beyond probably what we are talking about today.
An important aspect of that collaboration is that it's grassroots. And it's very hard to push collaboration down. That means that if it doesn't happen at that university, or it doesn't end up in the ICT budget of a government, the grassroots failure is there, which is fairly unfortunate. And
So question, what do you think is in fact the proper role of government? We've got examples like China and Japan that have more or less said, turn it on. We've got the example of U.S. Department of Defense, which made in October 2005, made a basic purchasing requirement that the only things that they would buy were things that were software upgradable to IPv6. And whether they followed through, that's another discussion, but at least they made the statement. We have also the experience here in the European Union, which with research frameworks 5, 6, and 7 had significant IPv6 components. And you've got governments coming out and essentially being a good customer. So what's the proper role of government? What's the best use of government in this? Matt, Christine? You might want to use the mic.
I have a comment that it is not directly answering the role of government per se, but I want to come back to that. I think that if we could be very specifically proactive, when you talk about getting it going in universities, I have been working on pushing IPv6 to really happen at a series of levels in a major university in the States. And I think that there is a way to, it's almost like naming and shaming, actually, at this point, that has a role to play. Because if you actually look at any university in a state, and there are many of them who don't have it, it's a three-pronged attack. It's finding a champion on faculty. It's finding students who really care, because all of a sudden they still have to do 4 and there's no other, they're not being taught 6. And at the state level, in many cases, there's a sort of strategic plan, but there still is this idea that there isn't any urgency because they've got enough 4, therefore they don't think there's a problem. And yet, when you actually sort of take the bull by the horns and ask them if they only want to go on collaborating with themselves only, they sort of suddenly sit up. So I think that there actually is a way to think about, literally, choosing a target, choosing a series of when I say targets target universities, for example, and making a plan, a really specific plan. Okay, how are we going to do this, right? We're going to go for faculty, we're going to go for students, we're going to go for IT. I mean, you know, it takes that kind of actual specific and practical planning to make people get off their duff. And it does work, because I just did it in a few months in a particular university where they've been sitting on their backsides for years. And I'm not, you know, I know how to break computers.
So we only have 5 minutes left, so I want to spend that largely on this question.
Microphone, please, for the interpreters. Thank you.
So we've got 5 minutes left, I'm told. I'd like to look specifically at this question of where does government fit? And since it's come up actually several times. So who wants to address that? Sure.
So number one, this is not a standard answer, but it depends on how up to speed the government is in terms of the issue. You know, how much do they understand technically about the issue? Obviously, a government cannot produce a program, do a legislation if they fundamentally misunderstand the technology. So expecting government to provide incentives or to create adoption or tax incentives or whatever when they misunderstand the technology and its adoption curve and its benefits, those three things, I think is dangerous. So first step is making sure that the officials in charge, those who really ought to be involved, understand what they're dealing with. The case in the recent case is SOPA, that the people who wrote the legislation for SOPA really didn't understand what they were dealing with, and just had the benefit in mind that was sold to them, but didn't understand the inner workings of it. So that's number one. Number two is if the government has a clear understanding, then I think they can be beneficial in some cases by kickstarting adoption, particularly if they are a large buyer from the commercial sector, such as was the case with DNSSEC. You know, you can think of the same thing with Walmart and RFID. However, that cannot be the only. So in other words, you can't have an over-reliance on government. That would only be as a nice-to-have, but not a must-have. The must-have, I think, is still fundamentally the private sector, the few adopters, the early adopters, their motivations, and a plan of being able to continually bring in, from a grassroots perspective, collaborators whose motivations will be a little bit different in, the early majority, the late majority, and so forth, and understanding that curve. And to the extent that government can help, great.
So, Patrick.
Thank you. I think when talking about what potential role governments have, I think specifically when mentioned like SOPA and those kind of like proposals, I think you phrased it really well, Alexa, when you talked about the authors of that proposal. Because we have to remember that those specific proposals did not go through, which means that the governments actually probably did understand. They didn't approve them, right? Okay.
Well, what they understood was that they were going to get voted out of office if they passed it through.
So that's exactly my point, that we need to be a little bit careful because we can look at these kind of proposals and we can look at, for example, actually approved legislation. And those are two very different things, and we can blame different parties. Another thing that we should not forget is the role of governments and public sectors as users and customers, because they have a different kind of responsibility of the growth and the sustainability of their society. And so that is not sort of the legislative branch that are looking at that, but more the operative branch. And at least in Sweden, where I come from, where I'm based, the government is really trying to get public sector to understand that they actually have that responsibility and should probably not be the last player to the table to deploy security-related issues, including using things like common criteria, like audit processes for products that they are procuring.
That resonates a lot with what I had said already, that governments has a leading by example role. I also want to be careful with saying the government. It depends a lot on the culture, the regional culture of a government, how the approaches in the West or the place where I come from is going to be different from the approach that's taken elsewhere. But I think that the basis is that this type of deployment that need to happen on the core of the network is also a responsibility of the private sector. It's also a responsibility of the academia. It's also a responsibility of the users. And while all those stakeholders do not necessarily have to know and understand the details, there is a bunch of people that need to look beyond self-interest in upgrading that network. Because in the end, it's about making sure that we move forward with an internet on which my children can build the next Facebook. My children can build the next Google. My children can build that collaborative network that you've been longing for. We need to maintain that. That's what we want. Oh, gee.
Okay, so a final statement?
Yes, I think on the government participation point, I think we all agree that the government has to have a light role in regulating or driving the process. The government has to play a role of facilitation, of leadership, or of guiding, creating the enabling environment for the private sector and other stakeholders to be able to embrace those technologies. That is a fact. Now, how do we make sure that government play that role efficiently is the question for us, through certainly capacity building on different way, getting them to understand the impact of those technologies in what we are doing. And secondly, as Olaf just said, we have to understand that we are moving into an area of the internet which is based on shared responsibility. That shared responsibility calls us. There is no other way to collaborate, to talk to each other, to work together, to maintain this new technology, to maintain this thing which is becoming part of our day-to-day life. And if we don't get that profoundly, we will fail, because the shared responsibility aspect is the core.
Okay, well, thank you very much then. It's the top of the hour. I need to bring this to a close, and thank you very much.